Hey, good morning, everybody. It's Mr. Rader here for AP World History Final Exam Review. And today we're going to be looking at the 20th century into the early 21st century. So let's get started. Okay, so this lecture is going to cover units 8 and 9, the Cold War, decolonization, and globalization. Some of the topics that we're going to look at: colonial pursuit of independence, global power struggle between capitalism and communism, illustrated in the Cold War, and the causes and effects of the unprecedented connectivity of the modern world. Everything from the rise of cloud based technologies to fiber optic cables, increasingly globalized marketplaces, so on and so forth. All right, so what we see here is a list of potential questions that have been used in past AP exams on the 20th century, and just going to read through a few of them to kind of get us thinking about the kinds of questions and the historical thinking skills that can be assessed on this exam. So the first one is a continuity and change question. Choose two of the areas listed below and analyze how each area's relationship to global trade patterns changed from 1750 to the present. Be sure to describe each area's involvement in global patterns around 1750 as your starting point. Okay, so with this particular problem, it's looking at it from pretty broad spectrum-based history, and it's looking at different regions of the world. And we'd want to consider specific categories of change and to consider what has actually changed over time. To get a complexity point, you'd want to do some comparison as well. All right, so let's take a look at this one. It's another comparison that brings in some continuity and change. Social revolutions have occurred in diverse countries, such as Russia, China, Mexico, and Iran during the 20th century. In analyzing the outcomes of these revolutions, what is more important, the cultural continuities or the changes that occurred as a result of these revolutions? Pick two of the above mentioned countries and compare. So it's a very interesting way to go about the comparison process to understanding the consequences of particular movements, in this case, social and political revolutions. Okay, so in the 20th century, now this particular PowerPoint is from the older AP exam, so instead of 1900 to the present, it was 1914. And in terms of the periodization scheme, we're really looking at the outbreak of the First Global World War. So some major themes in the 20th century: world conflict and the dissolution of global empires. So in the last video, we looked at the rise of the British Empire, the fact that since Great Britain had territories all over the world in a very literal sense, the sun never set on the British Empire because it was always sunny out somewhere in the world. Decolonization really kicking off after the Second World War, the rising nationalism, and the decision, particularly in the Cold War, to either join the side of the Americans and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, join the Warsaw Pact under the Soviet Union, or to join the non-aligned movement and not to be aligned with either of those two particular countries. Social reforms, globalization, and environmental issues. So we can see really here looking at Unit 8 and then Unit 9. Okay, so when we think about the First World War, this slide is important. If you're going to remember any key fact, consider that with the Treaty of Versailles, it is the foundation for the Second World War because of the reparation clauses built into that treaty, since it was so one-sided against Germany. When the German Empire was disbanded, the Weimar Republic rose to power for a little over a decade. It was inefficient, and it was unable to really cope with the very unfair and say even-handed way of looking at the treaty. So, in terms of lasting peace, well, a couple of things did happen. So, Poland was once again created as an independent country. A League of Nations, which was a precursor to the United Nations, was formed. And for the first couple of years, there were no secret alliances. But now when we think about the revenge category, there's a lot more factors here that's going to take place, particularly in the 1930s, once Adolf Hitler is voted into power as the Chancellor of Germany and then uses the Enabling Act of March 1933 to consolidate his control as Chancellor of Germany. Okay, so some acts of aggression that led to the Second World War, splitting into three countries: Japan, Italy, and Germany. So in the early 1930s, the Japanese, they're looking for more resources. In particular, they want access to oil, petroleum, to help develop their economy. They invade northern China in 1931, and they take over Manchuria and rename it Manchukuo, and then they invade mainland China in 1937. League of Nations condemns it. They do nothing. Italy attacks Ethiopia. In many ways, Benito Mussolini, who was the leader of Italy, wanted revenge for the fact that the Italians were the only European power to lose to an African country in 1896 in the Battle of Ottawa. It was a humiliation that lasted for decades, and Benito Mussolini, as part of his goal, was restoring the might and the glory of the Roman Empire. He wanted to start that campaign by attacking Ethiopia. As you can see, it was to distract the Italians from the depression, to build a new empire again. League of Nations condemns it, but they don't do anything, right? You'll see that that's a general pattern here when we look at the Allies' reactions, really up until September 1st, 1939, when the Third Reich, under Adolf Hitler and the German Wehrmacht, invade Poland. Once they invade Poland, then the British and the French are going to declare war within a few days, and the war will be embroiled in a global conflict once again. So, speaking about the concept of appeasement, these are two quotes. One seems to be supporting the idea of appeasement. That's the idea of Neville Chamberlain, Peace in Our Time. And then Winston Churchill, who becomes the Prime Minister of Great Britain, realizes very clearly early on that, and I like this quote, an appeaser is one who feeds a crocodile hoping it will eat him last. So it's the idea that negotiations can only go so far when engaging in diplomacy with hostile neighbors. Another analogy that I've used in my own classroom when I teach this concept is think of a crying child in a grocery store. The child wants a piece of candy, a lollipop, some kind of a snack, right? And parent has a couple of choices. Like the parent can leave with the child and just cancel their shopping spree. The parent can give in to the demands of the child and buy them the candy, or the parent can refuse, let the child throw a tantrum, maybe discipline them, and then not buy them the candy, right? So there's three different prongs of approach. Buying the child the piece of candy is appeasement because then the lesson that the child learns is anytime I want a piece of candy, well, I'll just throw a temper tantrum and then I'll get that piece of candy. The analogy works pretty well. It's not foolproof, but it does kind of get to the heart of what was happening in the 1930s with the annexation first of the Sudetenland, then of Austria in 1938, and then of Czechoslovakia. Okay, so when we're thinking about the early years of the Second World War, this map does a pretty good job in explaining it. So with the Blitzkrieg, it's essentially a lightning war. So the Germans attack by land, by air, and by sea. So in terms of establishing their empire, you'll notice that prior to 1941 June, the Germans do not invade Eastern Europe. They actually went into an agreement with the Soviet Union, the Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, where they both essentially agreed to divide up Poland, and then Germany could focus on the western borders. Once they conquered France, June 1940, and began their bombing campaigns of Great Britain, they began to turn their attention east. Now, why they did this, I'll never really know other than trying to understand the idea of Lebensraum, or more living room, because the Germans lost the First World War because they tried to fight a two-front war. It seems that the German high command did not learn their lesson, so they attack again. Operation Barbarossa, they invade the Soviet Union, and lo and behold, they go to war again, and eventually they are going to lose, with the Battle of Stalingrad really being one of the major turning points in the war by 1942 into 1943. And the land-based invasions of North Africa, the campaigns after Pearl Harbor of December 7th, 1941, and then the landing on the beaches of Normandy in France as part of their campaign on the West. As you can see, most of the countries were involved either on the side of the Allied powers, the Axis powers, Axis expansion, and Switzerland, who remained neutral throughout the conflict, along with Spain, who was involved in their own civil war under Francisco Franco. They were ideologically aligned with the Nazis. In many ways, actually, the Nazis helped Franco's armies in the preceding decade, in the 1930s, consolidated their control, but Spain never really lends any military assistance to the Third Reich. Okay, so some key turning points. I mentioned some of them before. The American landing of Normandy, Operation Torch in North Africa, El Alamein, thinking about what's happening in Egypt, and then the invasion of Sicily and Italy in 1943. So, thinking about what's happening in Japan at the end of the war. So, the Americans, after dropping the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 6th and August 9th, 1945, respectively, the Americans do occupy Japan for several years. One of the first things that they do is they force the Japanese to sign a new constitution and limits the power of the emperor. The American High Command under MacArthur understood that if they tried to take the emperor out of power entirely, they would have had civil strife on their hand. It never would work. The Japanese people would not accept the American taking over their entire society. So they left the emperor in power, but they limited his power. The idea was to disband the Japanese armed forces and to force the Japanese essentially in their constitution to pledge to have a pacifist constitution, to never go to war again. They do accept it, and by 1952, the Allied occupation officially ends. This flowchart helps us to understand the overall impacts of the Second World War, kind of considering what are some of the major ideologies and patterns and trends before the Second World War. So they look at the role of imperialism, colonialism, industrialization of the West, mass production of weapons, essentially forming the foundations for what the Americans call the arsenal of democracy, the idea of using mechanized war as part of their economy. These are some of the major costs of the war, consequences of the war. And in many ways, this is what the post-Second World War would look like. So in territories that were being decolonized, this is where the term third world country comes into play. Nowadays, we refer to those regions as really developing countries, and countries that were in the first world as developed. But really, it was the idea of looking at the first world with the Americans, second world with the Soviets, and then the third world being these developing countries. So at the time, we do see a Cold War begin to develop between the Americans and the Soviet Union. Really does get encapsulated in a nuclear arms race, in a space race, and in a series of competitions to make individual countries more powerful. The United Nations is formed, and they have a mixed legacy that doesn't always work in terms of their compromise and resolutions. But many of their Security Council resolutions have prevented regional conflicts from really exploding into global world war conflicts. It's really going to be the creation and the proliferation on a large scale of the nuclear weapons that is going to stop a potential third world war because of a concept known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The idea is that if one country, America, let's say the United States, attacks the Soviet Union in a preemptive strike, Soviets can intercept it in Moscow and send nuclear warheads into the United States. So there was this idea of an anxiety in the Cold War as to really this idea of, well, what's going to happen, if there was some kind of a nuclear Armageddon. They came close a few times. So from the American perspective, the Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the close calls. Okay. So the formula for understanding social movements and revolutions in the 20th century, take a moment and read over these bullet points. Okay. So if we're looking at reform in Cuba, say the collapse of the Fulgencio Batista reign, 1959, the rise of Fidel Castro. If we're looking at Mao Zedong and the Communist Revolution, the formation of the People's Republic of China by 1949, we're really looking at agrarian revolutions initially led by a peasantry, and essentially new ideas about land distribution, similar in many ways to what we learned about in really as part of the last unit, but it does tie into this unit, thinking about the Mexican Revolution of 1910. Speaking of Mexican Revolution, okay, so this slide is just really looking at one of the earliest revolutions of the 20th century, agrarian based, really strongly supported by the peasantry. Series of conflicts within that decade, 1910 to 1920, thereabouts. Um, and some of the results by 1917, they have a constitution. There are land reforms, and they do nationalize and take over key resources, really to limit the role of the United States of America. There are restrictions on clerical education and church ownership of property. That's a pretty big change. And in terms of the revolution, they don't inspire other revolutions throughout Latin America at this time. So when we compare revolutions, there's many ways that we can go about doing this. I think one of the more interesting comparisons we can make is between the Russian Revolution, the Communist Revolution, and the Mexican Revolution. Now, why do we start in 1905 in Russia? Well, that was the year of Bloody Sunday. This was the year where the Russian people really tried to begin to resist the rule of the Tsar, Nicholas II, and they wanted to change the system of the Duma, their parliament, and well, let's just say it didn't really work. And by the outbreak of the First World War, 1917, there's the March Revolution and the October Revolution. By the October Revolution, Vladimir Lenin consolidates control. There is a civil war between the Red Guards and the White Guards. You don't need to really know it for this exam. But really, he promises three things: peace, bread, and land, PBL, and Marxist reforms. They take out the Tsar. By 1924, Lenin dies of a stroke. Joseph Stalin comes into power, and they begin to switch to a policy of collectivization and heavy industry investments. Now, for the Mexican Revolution, again, around the period of 10 years, again, similar peasants are involved in both. They both want land reform. They both want political rights. The results, you get autocratic leaders in both. Although in the case of the Mexican Revolution, there is some still foreign control of industry. Socialist reforms, Marxist reforms, there are some connections between the two. And then some key events from thinking about Diaz to Francisco Madero, Huerta, Emiliano Zapata, and thinking about essentially what happens in terms of the consequences of these revolutions. Okay, so just take a moment, look at these two paintings, and I want you to consider the role of propaganda, state-based propaganda systems, and how painting illustrations can be successful at allowing individuals to develop a cult of personality, in this case, Chairman Mao, and how he's able to do this to really gain the support of the peasantry in China in the 1930s and 40s. Okay. So, thinking about what's happening in China as our case study, so during the Second World War, the communists, they expand their base of support. They use various appeals for women. So one of the first things that Mao does pass in 1951 as part of an amendment to their governing documents is an equality amendment for women and for marriage. There's growth of the party through the use of anti-Japanese propaganda. They go back into a civil war between the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists under Mao Zedong. And by 1949, the leaders of the Kuomintang, they flee to Taiwan. Taiwan is actually recognized as the Republic of China until, I believe, 1970 or 1971 in the United Nations. By 1971, the UN switches China to the mainland China, or the People's Republic of China, and to this day, in 2020, Taiwan is still not formally a member of the United Nations, and China, the People's Republic of China, still considers Taiwan to be a part of China. So the Cuban Revolution I mentioned before, a couple of key moments to consider. It doesn't happen overnight. So within a 6-year process, the Batista regime that was supported by the Americans is overthrown by Fidel Castro. He nationalizes his businesses. It's very similar in many ways to the nationalization of the Suez Canal in 1956 by Gamal Nasser, as another example, to just thinking about how countries get involved, whether they lean socialist, whether they lean democratic, or if they go into the non-alignment movements, and really looking at the roles of Castro and Che Guevara in creating the Cuban state. Okay, so in the 1970s, by the end of the decade, we're going to see the overthrow of the Shah. We're going to see the expulsion of the Americans from the Iranian state. And we're going to be seeing the Iran hostage crisis, which really stretches through the last year of the Carter administration. And as soon as Ronald Reagan is inaugurated as president, they are released from Iran. It's going to be the decade, the 1980s. We're going to see the use of chemical weapons again between Iran and Iraq. That is going to lead to, among other things, casualties of over 1 million people. So it's a pretty tragic conflict that takes place. Understanding what happened, though, with the Islamic Revolution in 1979, really, you have to kind of understand American interventionism after the Second World War. So the Shah is going to come to power because the Americans under the CIA overthrow the popularly elected leader Mossadegh, and they put this guy in power. And this guy uses secret police. He uses all sorts of coercion tactics. And by the late 1970s, there's a lot of problems in Iran. There's economic depression, inflation, etc. And Ayatollah Khomeini is going to capitalize on this, and he's going to overthrow the Shah and their government. Okay, decolonization. There's a lot of key moments and key individual countries that are going to get their independence in the late decades of the 20th century. I just want to go over three patterns. Violent revolutions, we'll see this in the People's Republic of China in 1949. We'll see this in the Algerian struggle against France, culminating in the Algerian War of 1962. The Vietnam War, which most of you are familiar with in your studies of American and global history, but not just the American experience, thinking from 1954 or so with the initial advisors to really thinking about what's happening in 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin and the Tonkin Resolution, but also considering the role of France before the Americans got involved. It was a French colony. And it's important to understand that this is, for the Vietnamese, for example, under Ho Chi Minh, it wasn't really about this idea of communism. It was about being given a seat at the table with the major powers of the day and being given their independence from the colonial powers because of their support in the First World War. Negotiated independence, so India, by 1947, they're going to be given the right to rule from Great Britain. Ghana and Turkey, when we see the rise of Ataturk, 1923, and the creation of the Republic of Turkey. And then a mixture we see in Kenya, Egypt, and South Africa. These are some specific details about what happened in Algeria in their war against the French. Really understanding the conflicts between the Algerian people and the French settlers who were there, who considered Algeria to be a part of France. By 1962, Ahmed Ben Bella becomes the first president. It's a one-party state, and there are some current challenges by Islamic fundamentalists. India. So the foundations of their nationalistic movement, 1885, their Indian National Congress. It's an elite group. Highest castes are going to get their representation. It's not really done through the masses. We won't really see that until the middle decades of the 20th century under Jawaharlal Nehru and Mohandas Gandhi. In Africa, there are many different ways to see how decolonization takes place. It's important to be aware of the non-alignment movement, and it's important to understand why many of the African nations did turn to elements of socialism as it related to their countries. Some countries developed parliamentary democracies. We see that happening in Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah. So these two maps help to kind of speak to decolonization over time and considering who was controlling Africa during the time of imperialism, what areas were independent. So, like, for example, Ethiopia, they remained independent the entire time. Liberia, and even Egypt was nominally independent, but the British were influencing them in many ways. And then by the latter decades, we can see really up until some cases, the late 1980s, in terms of control of some of these regions. Kenya. It's interesting. Kenyatta's name is spelled wrong. It should be Jomo Kenyatta, not Jono Kenyatta. But okay. He uses nonviolent protests in order to try to secure control over the country. The Mau Mau Revolt, 1952, is led by the Kikuyus and is supported by the Kenyan states. It's suppressed by the British. There's a whole story about that. If you're interested in learning more about the role of essentially what were British concentration camps in Kenya, there's a really good book called The Imperial Reckoning by Carolyn Elkins. I read it when I was in grad school at Stony Brook. It's definitely a worthwhile read if you are more interested in learning about what was happening in Kenya in the 1950s. By 1963, they are given their independence. Kenyatta becomes the leader of the country. Egypt, okay. So in 1952, there's a coup d'etat. Gamal Abdel Nasser, the individual I mentioned before, the nationalization of the Suez Canal, establishes an Egyptian state. They nationalized the canals, protested by the Israelis, the British, and the French, but it says diplomacy, but really it was the United States of America strong arming then Prime Minister Anthony Eden of Great Britain that eventually forced the British to capitulate to Egyptian demands and to allow them to continue nationalizing their canal. So South Africa, so several things that are happening at this time. So by 1948, we're going to see the rise of the Afrikaner Nationalist Party. We're going to see by 1948 the establishment of apartheid. In many ways, you could think of it like the Jim Crow policies in the United States of America following Reconstruction. It's forced separation, separate and unequal, and repression really taking place in many places. By 1990, apartheid is going to officially end, and in 1994, the first open elections in South Africa, they will elect Nelson Mandela as the first Black president of South Africa. So thinking about nationalism, there's many ways to kind of conceptualize this. So just to show you some ideas, we see failed traditional rebellions, which leads to the world wars, Western-inspired nationalist movements, leaders and goals, independent violence or nonviolent movements, building of the nation states, and then considering what modern societies look like that are not in the Western framework. So, what do all these men have in common? Well, among other things, each of these individuals are going to lead popular protest movements that will eventually lead in the creation of independent states. So, on this slide, there are a series of challenges of being independent. So, between ethnic disputes, so for example, when the Europeans carved up the map of Africa at the Berlin Conference in 1885, they really did not care about existing tensions that had existed for centuries between different African groups, different ethnic groups. And this is going to lead to a lot of conflict once these countries are given their independence. Dependent economies, growing debt, widespread social unrest. If there are not an abundance of resources, there are going to be conflicts. Population growth, a lack of a middle class, education deficits. Brain drain is a concept where you take the educated people of a particular place. So, for example, a lot of the middle class, upper middle class individuals from a lot of the African countries came over to the United States or would send their children over to the United States to get an American education in American universities, and then they would stay there in the United States or in Europe and not return. So that is a concept that still persists into the 21st century. Some general conclusions. Decolonization, it emerges very differently in different places around the world. Sometimes it's violent, sometimes it's not. Dependent in large part on how many settlers had actually come to the colony. In many parts of the world, it really wasn't revolutionary. In many cases, the empires that had controlled these territories just really couldn't afford them anymore. Their own resources were depleted on a very vast scale after the Second World War. There are going to be significant challenges facing these independent nations, and there's going to be a continued dominance of Western economics. And a lot of that deals with the system that gets built in during the age of imperialism, but then really also during the age of the Cold War, looking at the role, particularly of the American dollar as a universal or as like a pretty strategic business currency. so that, if economies had fluctuating currency rates, if you could use the American dollar as your standard for international trade, there could be a sense of stability in global commerce. So, some competing ideological systems, this is really thinking about the Cold War. This breaks down the ideas of the United States and the Soviet Union, and these are just different components that can be involved within these systems. So, for example, if we're looking at the citizens have basic rights, well, does it fit in both? Does it fit in just one? Does it fit in neither? And thinking about like why that might be the case. So some U.S. policies, containment. It's going to lead to a lot of conflict. It's going to lead to a lot of war. It does directly relate to the idea of domino theory, that there really is a very strong fear, first articulated by Secretary of State George Kennan, that if the Americans were to allow regions and countries around the world to become communist, then all of their surrounding neighbors would also become communist. It's one of the main reasons why the United States stayed involved in Vietnam for so long. The Truman Doctrine is going to be used for the same reason, and the Marshall Plan. Both of these are examples of soft power. So we talk about like Vietnam, we talk about the Korean War. That's hard power. That's the military. But the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan, this is really soft power. This is the Americans really giving into resources, economic assistance to really help other countries. All right. The Soviet response. So we see the Berlin blockade. So in the past lesson, one of the things that I put on Google Classroom is you can see the map. So when you look at Germany, the country gets split in two, West Germany and East Germany. However, the city of Berlin is well within East Germany, and they split that city into four sectors: American, British, French, and Soviet. And the challenge is, how are you going to bring in supplies into this city, into the American, the British, and the French sectors, if the Soviet Union blocks off the land access? Well, their response is to take it into the air. And that's what they do. The Iron Curtain. Pretty self-explanatory, as you can see in the map. These are some details to keep in mind. We mentioned the Korean War before. So to this day, there are still two Koreas, and that's because the war officially ended in an armistice, 1953. And as a result, technically there's a demilitarized zone at the border of the DMZ, where you still have armed guards there today as of 2020. Technically, the war is still on. I mean, they had an armistice, they agreed to stop fighting, but there was never a peace treaty. Okay, now understanding the collapse of communism, the end of this conflict between the Americans and the Soviet Union, really will kind of take place with a collapsing Soviet economy, 1986, 1987. The policies of glasnost and perestroika under Mikhail Gorbachev, and really thinking about this: low worker morale, food shortages, cost of this war, the idea of just like if the Soviets are investing so much of their money into their military apparatus, they're not going to have money for consumer goods. So there's an analogy in economics, the idea of what's called a production possibility frontier. Let's say hypothetically you have two resources that you can invest in: guns and butter. Butter really illustrating food and other consumer goods, guns really self-explanatory, weapons. Now, let's say you have $100 million, just throwing out a hypothetical number. Government budgets are usually much bigger than that. So with that $100 million, you have to make a choice, right? And how you decide to allocate that money is going to influence what you can actually do with that money. So while the Americans were able to strike a better balance between guns and butter, the Soviet Union invested a lot more money into guns, which made it very hard for them to have any money left over for butter, these food supplies, etc., which will lead to a collapse of their empire. December 25th, 1991, Christmas Day, is where we're actually going to see the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union and the creation of the Russian Federation. Okay, global economics. So this is really understanding globalization and the role of international organizations. So this is looking at the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the World Trade Organization, as ways to create agreement policies, to have established trade practices, the role of the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere, the global North, the global South, interdependence, so on and so forth. This slide brings us to one of the darker moments of the 20th century. It's actually a really good book that I actually have on the bookshelf back there. It was written by a former UN ambassador. It's called, if I remember correctly, I think it's called The Century from Hell. And it's a book that actually depicts some of the major genocides that took place in the 20th century. And you can see some of the details here on this screen in terms of just looking at the literal human cost. But the numbers really, they don't capture the the tragedy or the horrific nature of it, because a number is a number, but you got to realize when you peel back the layer, and every number is a human life and has a family and a story to it. And it's important to try to look at those human connections when we really try to understand the consequences of genocide, and if and how there can ever be any kind of reconciliation for the things that take place. Okay, some other key things to consider. So, continued urbanization. So, by the 20th century, about 90% of the world's population is going to be living in cities, maybe 10 to 15, depending on where. Will still be in rural type environments. The Green Revolution. So, this is going to really begin in the decades after the Second World War, looking at the Commercial Revolution. I got to really ignore it. Get to that phone or something. But really looking at the role of chemical fertilizers, pesticides. For example, DDT was used widespread prior to the rise of the environmental movement. And essentially thinking about how we can use traditional agricultural methods to mass produce food. Deforestation is one of the direct consequences. We'll see entire areas being stripped. So we see that today in Indonesia, we see it in Brazil and the Amazon. The ozone depletion has gotten a little better. There were some protocols that were built in the Montreal Protocol to try to address this. And global environmental efforts, the first Earth Day in 1970, the creation of the EPA, all under Richard Nixon and his Republican administration. Okay, and we're going to end with the same set of prompt practices that we saw before. Just again, considering the kinds of questions that you might see on an AP exam. All right, so that's going to do it for today's lesson, today's lecture. I hope you all learned something valuable, and please reach out if you ever have any questions. All right, everybody, take care.